Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. My name's Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of the Boston University's Global Development Policy Center and on the GDP Center, as we like to call it. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment. And on behalf of BU's GDP Center, BU Federal Relations, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, we welcome you to this exciting and important session that we're having this morning on a new multilateralism for shared prosperity. The multilateral system that stemmed from 1944 Bretton Woods Conference is in crisis. That was confirmed this week by the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, a collaboration of 60 agencies such as the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and a number of UN agencies across the system. And in their new report that they released this week, they see the crisis as a result of the uneven distribution of the benefits and the costs of the system. That was not the intent of the framers of the original Bretton Woods institutions in 1944, who, to quote U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, that it promised to be a new deal in international economics based on a principle that prosperity, like peace, is indivisible. The original design of the IMF, the World Bank, and what later became the World Trade Organization was to steer finance and trade towards full employment and peaceful prosperity. The system has always been far from perfect, and that's why folks come to Washington every April to try to figure out how to improve it. But it's now in crisis and is characterized by financial instability, inequality, and a global climate breakdown. In 2015, the world had realized this and came together in almost another 1944-like manner to forge the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accord. More recently, however, these efforts are being rolled back by the United States and a small handful of other governments. Most recently, as you all know, the United States has signaled its withdrawal of the Paris Climate Accord and has showed disdain for the Sustainable Development Goals in general. They've threatened to withdraw from the World Trade Organization and have declared trade wars on close allies, neighbors, and China. They've stifled calls for an open and merit-based selection of the president of the World Bank, which has resulted in this week in the appointment of an individual who has openly criticized the multilateral system and denied climate change. And they may be standing in the way this week of a quota reform at the International Monetary Fund that would give it the resources it needs to prevent and mitigate financial crises and open up the voice and representation of the fund to the broader representation of nations in the world. When we founded our center a year and a half ago, Ban Ki-moon was the inaugurated us, and he said, "Get out of Boston. Don't only just do policy-oriented research for academic journals that nobody reads, be part of a global conversation on these issues." And in that spirit, with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development's Globalization and Development Strategies group, we've been convening a number of public and private workshops over the past 8 months to try to identify what some of the core drivers of this crisis are and to put forth a set of principles to move forward for a new multilateralism. Some of that's captured in this report that you all have here called The New Multilateralism for Shared Prosperity, Geneva Principles for a Global Green New Deal. We hope that it helps in a conversation for an agenda for a new multilateralism that rewrites the rules towards a goal of coordinated stability, shared prosperity, and environmental sustainability while deliberately respecting the space for national policy sovereignty. To continue this conversation, we have 3 of the world's biggest leaders on the multilateral system. We have Her Excellency Ms. María Fernanda Espinosa, who is here from the United Nations on the screen right here. On the 5th of June of 2018, the United Nations General Assembly elected Ecuadorian Foreign Minister María Fernanda Espinosa as the president of its 73rd session. Only the 4th woman to hold the position in the history of the world body, and the first since 2006. The president has more than 20 years multilateral experience in international negotiations, peace, security, defense, disarmament, human rights, indigenous people, gender equality, sustainable development, environment, biodiversity, climate change, and multilateral cooperation. She served in Ecuador as the Minister of Foreign Affairs twice, the Minister of National Defense, and the Coordinating Minister of Natural and Cultural Heritage. We're also honored to have with us the Honorable Amor Mottley. The Honorable Amor Mottley became Barbados' 8th and first female Prime Minister on May 25th, 2018. Ms. Mottley was elected to the Parliament of Barbados in September 1994 as part of the new Barbados Labour Party government. Prior to that, she served as one of the 2 opposition senators between 1991 and 1994. One of the youngest persons ever to be assigned a ministerial portfolio, Ms. Mottley was appointed Minister of Education, Youth Affairs, and Culture from 1994 to 2001. She later served as the Attorney General and Deputy Prime Minister of Barbados from 2001 to 2008, and was the first female to hold that position as well. We also have Professor Joseph E. Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz is an American economist and professor at Columbia University. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD. It's a long one. And the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. He's a recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal of 1979. And he was the former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and former member and chairman of the United States Council on Economic Advisors. In 2000, he founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, one of the premier university-based think tanks on development in the world. And he has a new book coming out later this month called People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. We've asked each of these speakers to make some opening remarks for about 10 minutes to talk about from where they sit, what they see the crisis of multilateralism might be, and for different ways forward. After that, we want to have a global discussion with all of you folks who've come here from across the world, or from other parts of Washington, or from Boston, where it's not spring yet, is it? We will start with Her Excellency, and then we'll ask the Honorable Mia Mottley, and then Professor Stiglitz. Our first round of questions will go to Professor Stiglitz, just a couple, because he's going to have to leave a little bit early. Please help me in welcoming these 3 distinguished guests that we have today.
So, well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me acknowledge Kevin Gallagher from Boston University, my friend that I understand he's there, Richard Koselwright, director at UNCTAD, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to take part of this very, very exciting discussion. I am truly pleased to join you all this morning. I would like to acknowledge, of course, Her Excellency, Ms. Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a good friend of the House here at the UN from Columbia University, and all of you that are present there. So the subject of this discussion, reclaiming multilateralism, and that is something that weighs on my mind practically every minute of every day. And I am very grateful to Boston University's Global Development Center and the UN Conference on Trade and Development for organizing this meeting and for your really thought-provoking report on a global Green New Deal. And I am sorry that I am unable to be with you in person, and I'm sure that the cherry blossoms in New York can't compete with yours over there in DC. So I would like to focus my remarks today on what we need why we need to reclaim multilateralism, and in the context of what I believe are 2 tipping points and how we can go about doing that. On why reclaim multilateralism, the short answer is it does work. It works. It has delivered in the past, it is delivering now, and we need it to deliver in the future. This is not the view, of course, of a UN bureaucrat. It is the view of someone who has been at the sharp end of multilateral negotiations policy as my country foreign and defense minister, but also as an ambassador to the UN in New York and Geneva. It is the view of someone elected by 193 UN member states to preside over the work of the UN's most representative political body. And speaking from that perspective, let me assure you that contrary to rumors that might be circulating, multilateralism is not dead. It may be under threat, it is certainly being undermined, but it is alive and kicking, I would say. I see it working every day in every resolution we adopt, in the 50+ negotiating processes I help to facilitate here in the House. And I don't want to dwell on past collective achievements, from fostering peace in countries such as Sierra Leone or Timor-Leste, to clearing landmines, eradicating smallpox, and boosting literacy. Because even in these last extremely challenging years, we have adopted the Paris Climate Agreement, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. We have made progress on some of the hardest issues, adopting the Global Compacts on refugees and migrants last year, for instance. And at the same time, there is no doubt that this is a critical moment for the UN and for global cooperation. We know it is a make or break moment for climate change, for example. Last year, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the report made that frightening clear. We must reach peak carbon by 2020, and we are very close to that. But I believe we are approaching two other tipping points. First, I think that the social contract as conceived in the modern era no longer seems credible. Even the waning ability of governments to protect their citizens and promote their welfare. And now I am certainly not someone who believes the days of the nation state are numbered. Far from it. Just like multilateralism, national sovereignty is very much alive and kicking at the UN. And indeed, what I've been repeating over and over again, multilateralism goes hand in hand with sovereignty, offering states the way to pursue interests collectively while sharing costs and risks. But today there is virtually no problem that does not require global cooperation and collective action. That is obvious when it comes to issues like climate change or violent extremism. It is also increasingly true of traditional domestic issues, such as fiscal balances and job creation. And we are now at a point when the gains we have made in previous decades are slowing, even reversing, due to environmental, economic, and political instability. And add to that the fact that these gains were never distributed equally. And you have a lot of unsatisfied constituents, millions that have been excluded of the promised gains of globalization. You have those living with extreme deprivation, 840 million without access to safe water, 2 billion with no access to improved sanitation, 821 million hungry people around the world. These are really not very promising figures. And I have to say that one chart that really struck me in your report, Kevin and Richard, was the one showing the number of people living on $5.5 a day, which, if you exclude China, has been flatlining for the past 2 decades. And you have a younger generation, the largest, most educated in history, that worries it will be less well off than its parents. Youth unemployment, we are just ending the celebrations of the 100th anniversary of the ILO, and we have been talking here for 2 days about what to do with unemployment and underemployment. And one of the critical issues, of course, is youth unemployment that is currently very, very high and could worsen if we don't get the grips with the so-called fourth industrial revolution. The World Bank, as you know, estimate that automation could put 2/3 of the jobs in developing countries at risk. Young people also know that their carbon budget will have to be a tiny fraction of what all of us have enjoyed in the past. And the result of all of this is a growing disconnect between people governments and institutions, and they lose faith in our capacity and will to deliver. And this is contributing to the second tipping point that I wanted to address, the health of our international system. And we have seen a rise of nationalist sentiment, of unilateralism, attacks on international laws and norms. And I think that you mentioned this at the beginning of this conversation. This is creating a very difficult environment for decisions we need to take in the coming months and years. It is also having a detrimental impact on UN agencies in terms, for example, of funding. We are asking the UN to deliver more with significantly less. And I don't need to outline to this audience how grave the consequence of reaching these tipping points would be. We know that erosion of the social contract and erosion of international cooperation can lead to war. And I don't want to be dramatic here, but it can indeed lead to war. We are already seeing echoes from the lead up to the First and Second World Wars, I have to say. And we know that this time war could wipe us out through nuclear weapons, but also through sheer time wasted when we should have been dealing with climate change, for example. So how do we reclaim multilateralism? The ideas and principles set out in the Global Green New Deal report, I think that provide a solid starting point. I would build on them and contend that we have in the 2030 agenda something that comes very close to a global Green New Deal in ambition and of course, and in scope. We must achieve the Sustainable Development Goals because ultimately the key to reclaiming multilateralism is making sure it delivers for the people we serve. That will have more impact than any rousing speech we can make. And I hope you will allow me to direct a quick aside to the finance policymakers in the audience. We need to do much more to close the annual $2.5 trillion finance gap to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Research released this week by the think tank ODI has raised some serious questions about our approach to raising the private capital we desperately need. It shows that the amounts raised are still small, that most tends to go to middle and not to low income countries, and that every $1 of public investment generates just 37 cents in private finance for poorest states. I hope this is something you will make progress on during your time here and during the conversation today. And let's return perhaps to the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly. The reason I said that the 2030 agenda is nearly, but not quite, a global new Green Deal is because there is indeed a missing element. And this missing element is a vision and clear plan for reshaping the global economic governance. And I think that you're the experts on that. And we have seen how important action by groups such as the G20 can be, for example. But these groups are not universal, to say the least. They do not provide for meaningful input by smaller and poorer countries. They cannot produce outcomes with legal force or global buy-in. They cannot implement decisions without the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN bodies. I very much hope that this audience will revisit the excellent report produced by Professor Stiglitz in 2009 when I was Ecuadorian ambassador to the UN and during the international financial crisis. I think that we can use that brilliant report or of the Stiglitz Commission more and really just reread the report and the recommendations that it made at the time. In that context, let me end with a final thought on who should be reclaiming multilateralism. And of course, we need governments to make a strong national interest case for global cooperation and shared responsibilities. But it is also true that here at the UN, the main home of multilateralism, we need to communicate better. We need to deliver more. We need to be closer to the people we serve. We need to be more accountable and more relevant. But today, there are many other stakeholders that we also need to bring into the equation. Workers' unions, youth organizations, a diversity of grassroots groups that have more traction over people's lives on a daily basis. We need to really work closer to them. And we see daily how ordinary people, disconnected from the big global commitments and the new forces driving our world, dictate whether governments would make the big, bold decisions we need or not. Yet we have still not found adequate ways for these stakeholders to be embedded in global decision-making and delivery. This is something we should consider as we seek to reclaim multilateralism. And I thank you for your attention. I hope I kept the 10 minutes that were given to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Your Excellency?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Boston University and UNTAD as well. And welcome being on the panel with you, Madam President, and you, Professor Stiglitz. Multilateralism for us is not a luxury, it's a necessity. We will not survive as small states without a commitment to the rule of law and without a recognition that the unequal sizes of countries across the world admit of, regrettably, the temptation to bullying, which has taken hold in very many respects of the global community again. In 1966, Barbados became independent. In the first address to the United Nations, our then Prime Minister delivered himself of words that have come to characterize all of us, successive governments, irrespective of political parties. And those words were that we would be friends of all, satellites of none. I have come to office over the course of the last 10 months to understand that the promise of independence, the promise of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights has worn thin upon those who believe that they have the privilege to determine who should survive and who should not survive in this world. It has worn thin on those who believe that the rule of law can be ignored with impunity. It has worn thin for those who believe that the charters of the Organization of American States or the Charter of the United Nations no longer has the force of rule of law. It has worn thin on those who believe that the power of commerce and the power of multinational corporations can trump the survival of those of us who live in this world. Last year at the UN General Assembly, I had the, I don't even want to say honor. I was unfortunately subjected to a slide that has haunted me every night since then, and I spoke about it in my address at the General Assembly. Speaking about it means nothing, because for those to whom we speak, our states are invisible and dispensable. I speak specifically to that slide that talks about the implications of 3 degrees in climate change to the rest of the global community. It showed that Greenland, the Arctic and the Antarctic summer sheets, and the Coral Islands of the Caribbean, the Coral Islands of the Pacific, the Coral Islands who have produced Nobel laureates, who have produced dignified people, the Coral Islands that continue to be the place that many of you want to visit when you have a disposable income. These are the things that are now to be held dispensable, disposable, and continue to be invisible. We have seen as well, with the play out of what is happening in Venezuela, a regrettable even ignoring of the fact that Venezuela's other border is to the Caribbean community. That it's not just Colombia, that it's not just Guyana, but that Caribbean islands like Trinidad that are less than 3 miles away at points of their coastline, or Grenada, whose fishermen continue to be affected. And for us in the region, it's not a case of wanting to choose sides, because not one of us can go and vote in Caracas tomorrow if there was an election. It is a case of holding to the rule of law and holding to the charters to which the organizations to which we belong have held firm and on which they're premised. In spite of that, however, the threat of failing to take sides becomes a consequence which we have to bear. I have a speech in me that I'm not yet ready to give, how hard it is to be good in today's world, and how hard it is in particular for small states to be good. Professor Stiglitz, you have written much of your stuff premised on inequality. At 3 o'clock this morning, I was reading another article by you since the resignation, dismissal of the secretary here. And it reminds me that the fight that ordinary citizens have to carry at an individual level in a world that no longer respects their agency and their dignity of agency is the fight that small states have to carry in a world that no longer recognizes that independence of state and sovereignty are important. We ask, what is the future of multilateralism? In UNCTAD, you would be worried of necessity because WTO and all of the rules-based systems fought for seem to be at risk. For those of us who also want to look at economic future, we have the reality that while the United Nations was first deemed to be that body that should have responsibility for tax governance, 12 years ago, it shifted to the G20 countries to decide that it was going to be the OECD countries. And we've accepted that unwillingly, and we pay for the right for them to govern us and to put us on lists. But then you have the unilateral actions of those who determine that it is not good enough for there to be a single global standard-bearing body, but that their might and voice should also contribute by being able to have lists of all colors. I just pray that we would stop using black lists and white lists and use red lists and green lists, because it would be a little less offensive. But these are the things that we face every day. And whether we like it or not, no amount of advocacy as to the morality of it helps us. Because as Nipsey Hussle just said before he died, that those of us who have to face the plight of what it is to fight to survive do not have the luxury of being able to consider what is right or what is wrong, or to argue sometimes with impact what is moral and what is not. Why? Because people will simply make decisions to move their capital or to move their businesses or to ignore the needs that people have with respect to the movement of people, which of course is the no-no of the developed world, because money can move and not people. And we have therefore to determine how best do we right-size what appears to be a return to a feudal landlord-like system that existed centuries ago. I've held this in my hand because this is both a weapon and a tool. And in a very real sense, its greatest impact will not come on tax, as much as it is sexy for some people. It's not going to come, regrettably, on Venezuela or Libya or any of the countries of the world. Its greatest impact will come on that matter that will engage the attention of the greatest amount of people. Madam President, you referred to creating space for stakeholders like unions, like other groups in civil society. I entirely agree with that. But I do believe that the greatest impact will come on a movement of ordinary people who will stand up to defend the world in which they live, simply because they or their children or their grandchildren, whom they can touch, feel, and love, will be affected when the Arctic and the Antarctic summer sheets go, and when the coral islands of the Caribbean and the Pacific are threatened. For us, we have said over and over and over, it has to be 1.5 to survive. But in Paris, we agreed to 2 degrees. And last year, we have slides going around with 3 degrees. The world is making a judgment, not the people of the world, but the governments of the world are making judgments. And the day that the people of the world determine and find out that these judgments are made in their name, then I believe that the political pressure that is necessary that led, and I am not in any way advocating revolutions, but the political pressure that changes how politicians behave, and I am a politician, will start to make the difference. Because in every single period of global history, too far east has always been west. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Professor Stiglitz.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for inviting me, and Madam President, Prime Minister. I think the argument has been put very forcefully that multilateralism is necessary. The President pointed out that it's actually worked. It's been working. It's even more important, Prime Minister pointed out, it's an existential issue for countries like Barbados, for the Pacific Islands. It really goes to their ability to continue to exist as societies, as countries. Multilateralism is under attack. So we have this contradiction between the fact that it's actually worked and that it's under attack. As an economist, we think of when we have a globalized society, we become more interdependent, and what one part of the society does, one country does, has effects on others. And climate change is a absolutely essential example. And when you have things that one party can do that affects others, you need to have a system to address those, what we economists call externalities, those spillovers. And that is what multilateralism is about. But multilateralism is also about, as been emphasized, the rule of law. Since the Enlightenment, we have understood, prior to the Enlightenment, standards of living were basically constant for centuries and centuries. And then beginning around 1750, 1800, they started to increase very dramatically. And there were 2 reasons for that. One of them was science, the discovery of how we learned about the world. But the other one was social organization. How do we cooperate, work together? And a foundation of that cooperation is the rule of law. We can't function together without a rule of law. Now, the irony, of course, is that even with the rule of law, you could have the wrong rules. So I've been engaged, for 25 years criticizing the rules and saying they were unfair to developing countries. But I couldn't have imagined the world that we are in today that says we ought to return to the law of the jungle.
Exactly.
And that the big countries ought to be running the show, as the Prime Minister pointed out. The idea that international trade agreements, for instance, were unfair to the United States, for any of us who looked at how these agreements were written, is ludicrous, because it was the United States who dictated most of those rules. The problem is they were unfair to certain groups within the United States, to our workers, for instance, because they were dictated mainly by corporate interest within the United States. So certain subgroups of the population, our governments were not fully representative of all of our people, and we wound up with international agreements that were not necessarily fair to everybody. But the implication is not to abandon the rule of law. The implication is to reform those rules. Now, what is of concern to me today is that there is this attack on multilateralism exactly at the time when we need it even more as we face the problem not only of climate change, but of what's happening to our oceans, what's happening to our biodiversity, and issues of peace. So this is really a comprehensive agenda that we need to a set of concerns on multilateralism. So what I want to do, Kevin asked me to be a little bit more specific about some of the agenda, and I was very, very pleased that the President raised the 2009 report, because some of the things that we talked about in the report, most of the things have not come to fruition. And I just want to remind people about some of those things and why they were so important. Particularly for developing countries, what is needed is access to finance, but also access to markets and access to knowledge. And the global governance, the global rules have disadvantaged developing countries. And so let me just give a list. I can't elaborate on it, but I hope some of you go back and read these issues that we raised. The first is a global reserve system. Every year, countries, in effect, bury in the ground several $100 billion in the form of reserves, and that decreases global aggregate demand. And the way to offset that is to create a global reserve system. And that would provide several $100 billion every year to address problems of development, and particularly problems of climate change. The world said that they were committed to providing those amounts of money to help developing countries with climate mitigation and adaptation, but they haven't come up with the money. And this is an easy way of solving that problem. One of the big issues facing developing countries is not just that the advanced countries have not fulfilled their commitments to putting money into the countries, but in fact they've created a global architecture which has facilitated money moving out of developing countries. And what we're talking about here is the secrecy havens, the fiscal paradises. And what is important to realize is it's as much onshore as offshore. It's not just the banking system, it's America's real estate industry, which is famous for money laundering. I won't mention our money laundering chief, but it has an eviscerating effect on developing countries. Hundreds of billions of dollars moving out of the developing countries, money that would have facilitated development. The investment agreements are not about promoting investment in developing countries. They haven't actually worked. The good news is that there is beginning finally an awareness of the many ways in which investment agreements are not working. One of the ironies is that the Trump administration itself has attacked the investment agreements, and in the new Mexico-Canada-U.S. agreement, there is the investment provisions have basically been eviscerated, except for one small thing on oil and gas, and even then there is a provision about domestic exhaustion of remedies, or use of domestic remedies at first. At the UN a couple weeks ago, Untitled had a very good discussion of these. With most of the people in the room reflecting the interest of the lawyers who make money out of them. But there being, one of the big changes is that there were a strong voice from civil society and even from academia trying to explain why these investment agreements were so bad for developing countries. The trade framework is still not working. for developing countries. In 2001, there was an agreement for a development round of trade negotiations. But in the ensuing 15 years, the United States and Europe forgot that it was about development. And so they said, why, you know, they forgot that the Uruguay round had been unbalanced, that they had kept their subsidies for agriculture, they had kept escalating tariffs, all the kinds of provisions which were adverse to the interest of the developing countries, and did not want to actually have a development round. And so it was basically abandoned. And I think we need to go back to another true development round. Right now, there is a discussion about reforming the WTO. And the question is, yes, there should be reform. The question is, what are the reforms? And I think one of the reforms ought to be revisiting the development-oriented trade regime. There is a existential issue also for the WTO because the U.S. has refused to allow for the appointment of new judges, appellate judges. You cannot have a, you know, whenever you have an agreement, there are going to be disputes, and you have to have a mechanism for dispute resolution. Talking about how the multilateral system has worked, the dispute adjudication process has actually worked, I think, quite well. Yet the United States wants to kill it. A general point that I want to emphasize not only here, but about every aspect of multilateralism, multilateralism is too important to be killed by one country or by one person. And I think it will be important for the WTO, for instance, to go ahead and appoint judges, even if the United States opposes. And that will mean that there will be a rule of law for the rest of the world, and the United States won't be part of that rule of law. And that will mean companies will be less likely to want to trade, do business with the United States because there's no rule of law. It's a jungle. So I think the pressure will be put on the United States, therefore, to join the rule of law. So I think it is important for the rest of the world to go ahead in this area and in other areas with multilateralism. There are other aspects of the agenda, of the global economic reform agenda, that I'll just mention very briefly. The UN, one of the problems we know is that there is no sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, no bankruptcy. Every country has a bankruptcy law. There are situations where countries get overly indebted, and you have to have a systematic rule of law way of dealing with that. But the United States has consistently vetoed attempts to formulate that. The UN did adopt a set of, I think, very good principles for dealing with sovereign debt restructuring. The vast majority of countries voted for these set of principles. Unfortunately, a few big countries opposed, including the United States, and that has made it difficult to actually adopt these principles. But in the absence of this, it makes markets, bond markets, difficult to function. We also need better systems of macroeconomic coordination. Part of, that we wrote our report in 2009 in response to the global financial crisis. There had been inadequate coordination around the world in the regulations for finance, and that inadequate regulation is what led to a problem in one country, the United States, becoming a global crisis. But at that moment, under Gordon Brown, there was a concerted response where the countries were aware that how their own activities, efforts to re-stimulate their economies had spillovers to other countries. which is why there was a coordinated response and it worked. But after that moment in 2009, that kind of macroeconomic coordination began to fray. We argued in our 2009 report that it's important to have a global economic coordinating council with more legitimacy and more representativeness than the G20. And I think both of you have spoken to that issue. I said that it's not only about finance, it's about trade, it's also about knowledge. In a knowledge-based economy, that's becoming increasingly important. And the rules of knowledge, the intellectual property regime, say in the WTO, TRIPS, is not a pro-development regime. WIPO actually voted that there should be a development-oriented intellectual property regime. And I think that's an issue that ought to be revisited. When they talk about reform of the WTO, that ought to be one of the issues that is at the top of the agenda. Well, those are a few of the issues that I think specific reforms that are would make multilateralism in the economic sphere work better. Better for the entire world. And I think, remember, the reason the United States advocated multilateralism in the years after World War II was not just out of altruism, it was out of the belief that a multilateral system would be better for everybody. That kind of cooperation would be better for everybody. Well, in the final few minutes, I want to talk about four particular issues that, or three particular issues that are sort of going around today. The first has to do with the multilateral development banks and climate change. They just appointed somebody head of the World Bank who seems to be a climate skeptic and doesn't believe in multilateralism. I mean, it's sort of an extreme irony. I think it will be important for, and the World Bank has focused increasingly on not only addressing problems of poverty, which are important, but also affecting global public goods like climate change. And I think that's essential. So I think it will be important for all of us to make sure, in every other government, to put pressure on their representatives to make sure that the World Bank doesn't lose its mission in this area. It's actually been doing, I think, a pretty good job. With Nick Stern, we did a report on what kind of policies would be able to achieve a 1.5 to 2 degree thing, and it was a global commission, but we got a lot of support from the World Bank, and so they become really part of the almost a secretariat for those working in this area, and the same thing for the One Planet initiative that Macron has been doing. And I think we can't let the World Bank lose the central role that it plays in this area. The second issue is a very, very difficult one, and that is after the fall of the Iron Curtain, there was what Fukuyama talked about, the end of history. There was a presumption that everybody would converge in values to Western liberal democracies. And that was part of the impetus for bringing China and other countries into the fold. Well, now there's less conviction that we are all going to be converging. And that presents the challenge of, can we have a global trade regime among countries with different values? And we've already been aware of some of the difficulties of that. For instance, Europe believes, is skeptical of GMOs. And US thinks it's good to have GMOs. But that means that when Europe says that you have to disclose whether food is a GMO, US views it as a trade barrier because Europeans won't buy it. And it does affect what people buy. But obviously the right of people to make their own decisions seems to me primary. But that just illustrates the difference. But where we're seeing it as a greater challenge is in the context of big data, AI, one of the new technologies going forward, and values between China on the one hand, US on the other, and Europe on the other, on privacy and surveillance are markedly different. And will we be able to work out arrangements? The point I want to make is it is still the case that there are gains to trade. But the kind of Pollyannish view that we just take away trade barriers and we'll get efficient outcomes and socially desirable outcomes is probably not correct. So that will be important. Third, there is an attack by even some Democrats in the United States on the role of the World Bank in lending to middle income or lower middle income countries for the basis of climate change and poverty alleviation. The point is that large countries like China have a high income, not per capita. Per capita income is still 1/5 of that of the United States, and it's still classified as a middle income country or even a lower middle income country. So the question is, should the World Bank be engaged in helping them fight poverty and promote climate? Now you have to remember the World Bank actually makes money out of lending to a country like China. And that money they then recirculate to help the least developed countries. So it's part of a business model where they're simultaneously promoting a global public good and raising money. A business model raises money to help address poverty in the poorest countries. Unfortunately, this is being politicized in a context of a potential new Cold War, which would be very bad, I think, for global peace and stability. Finally, something that Kevin and his group has raised, I think is really important, which is the global Green New Deal. The Green New Deal in the United States has gotten a lot of attention. It comes from young people who realize that their future is at stake by not dealing with climate change. That it is going to require a massive mobilization of the kind that both the New Deal and World War II entailed. That this massive mobilization can be good for our economy. It's not a trade-off between growth versus climate. It's actually positive. They're complementary. And that this moment, just like the New Deal and World War II, was a moment when our society changed in a fundamental way. Women were brought into the labor force. We urbanized. What they realize is that this war to maintain our planet, is an occasion where we can use that war to help restructure our society in a positive way. Well, that's the way it's been conceptualized domestically in the United States. And I think extending that, it is really multilateralism. This is a global issue. I mean, if there ever were an issue that was global, this is it. And this is an opportunity for thinking about the global Green New Deal, to think about how we can reinvigorate multilateralism at the once again.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Wonderful remarks by the President, Prime Minister, and Professor Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz is going to have to leave in just about 10 minutes. So we're going to just take a couple questions just for him, and then we'll have a wonderful conversation with the Prime Minister and the President. So we can all get to know each other in this global conversation. Please raise your hand. I think we have a microphone. Yeah, we have a microphone back here. We'll pick on a couple folks and introduce yourself, and please keep your question short and sharp. These folks did say it all, but we did have coffee, so I'm sure right here in the front. Oh, I had pointed. Go ahead. Oh. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for your amazing remarks. My name is Debra James, and I coordinate the global network of civil society groups that work on the World Trade Organization. And we're particularly concerned about the efforts of developed countries to launch a new round of negotiations focused on digital trade, leaving behind the development agenda forever. And I wondered if any of you have any comments or insights on this. We're particularly concerned about the idea that it seems to be an effort by the biggest corporations in the world, big tech, based in the US, to grab ownership over the most valuable resource in the world, data, that we should be thinking about the issue of countries having the sovereignty to use that valuable resource for their national development and digital industrialization, and instead to keep it private and just use for the most powerful. And I wonder if this is something that you're seeing in your work, or if you have any comments on it.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm very concerned.
Let me take a couple. We'll
Okay.
take a couple, and you can
Sure.
answer them both. Right here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Grace Nagley from the New Statesman in the UK. Mia put it brilliantly when she said that the world in which capital is free to move but people are not is one in which the sovereignty of small states is limited and the agency of their people undermined. So to what extent does the panel think it's important to give small states, states in general, the policy space to be able to restrict capital mobility in order to promote their own development goals? Thank you.
Anyone on this side? The coffee was only over here? Here we go.
My name is Eric Garvin. I do business development consulting here in Washington. And I have a quick question about the impact of sovereign debt restructuring on the bond markets. I've never heard anybody make that connection before.
Great. Professor, you want to answer those, and then we'll
Sure.
make sure you get up.
So on the first question on digital, I think these are really important issues. I mean, people have talked about data as being the new natural resource. And I think within our own countries, we are gradually beginning to realize the wide set of problems that these digital behemoths represent for our society in terms of privacy, market power, manipulation, fake news, I mean, a whole set of issues. And there are real efforts going on, particularly in Europe, but also in California and a few other states, to try to devise a regulatory framework that addresses all four of these issues. Some countries like UK have come up with a competition focus that Jason Furman is chaired of. Germany has addressed the issue of market power and Facebook. So there are a number of efforts, but what is very clear is that none of these go far enough. And what I see is exactly, I think, what you see. The big corporations want to embed in international agreements a framework that will stop domestic legislation. And it seems to me that there should be no international agreement until there is a greater clarity about how to regulate them. Or if there is an international agreement, be very clear it's only temporary until there is a clarity about what the rules of the game, the regulatory structure ought to be. There are another set of issues that are going on in another set of forum that has to do with digital taxation. And there is a lot of concern that the principles of digital taxation, which tend to be focused on the destination where the activity occurs, where the sales occurs, will be used to shift the rights to tax multinational corporations away from where the production occurs to where the consumption occurs. And if that happened, that would have very adverse effects on developing countries. So digital taxation, the issue of digital has helped contribute to a revisiting of the multinational tax regime, but we have to be very careful about where that revisiting goes, and there are some elements of that give me concern. On capital mobility, this is one of the big changes that have occurred since I was at the World Bank at the end of the 90s. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, the IMF changed its institutional view about capital market restrictions. They said capital controls were sometimes a good thing. Now, I think they've taken a too narrow view, and there are people, obviously, who want to change them back to their prior view. But I think the evidence, theory, and empirical work is unambiguous that, particularly for small countries or less developed countries, that the imposition of what they call, people don't like the word capital controls because that sounds planning and controlling. They say capital account management techniques. So using euphemisms like that, it seems to me that there ought to be more. On the other aspect of finance is financial market liberalization. And most people forget that the United States internally did not believe throughout its development in financial market liberalization. We did not allow banks to operate in multiple states until 1994. And the reason was very clear. It was a development-oriented agenda. We wanted to develop not just New York City, which is a great city, but we also wanted the rest of the country to develop. And there was a real worry that money would all flow towards the United States, to New York City. And so we had laws that restricted those flows. And that is something that I think we ought to remember as we think. And the evidence, again, is that excessive focus on financial market liberalization impedes development. And one of the reasons is that you have too little lending to small businesses, which are the core of most developing countries. What was the third question about?
Sovereign debt restructuring, although
Yeah.
I promised you I would let you go.
Okay, so let me just say one word. Yes, sovereign debt restructuring will affect the bond market, but in the same way that having a better bankruptcy law gives better outcomes. You know, in the United States, we don't have, domestically, we don't have a bankruptcy law that applies to Puerto Rico. And if you want to see what happens when you don't have a good bankruptcy law, watch what's going on in Puerto Rico. It's a disaster. It's the hedge funds who bought the bonds fighting with each other, and who owns which bonds. You have one creditor group fighting another creditor group. All the creditors agree that they don't care if Puerto Rico goes into a downward spiral and everybody leaves Puerto Rico. The interests of the people of Puerto Rico are being shortchanged. there are some deep political problems, but it was an interesting case where the U.S. government explicitly said, because Puerto Rico is our colony, we will not allow you to be covered by, you cannot adopt your own bankruptcy law. They tried, and the U.S. government said, no, you're a colony, you cannot have your bankruptcy law. But as a colony, we have decided that you will not, our bankruptcy law won't cover you either. So they've been left in limbo. And it's, you know, it's a moral outrage, but you see in that instance how bad things work. So I think having a rule of law, come back to what we talked about in the very beginning, is useful. People know then what will the consequences be if you can't repay the debt.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, Professor Stiglitz. Madam President, would you like to comment on any of these questions? I know you might be going soon too.
Good to see you.
Well, yes, I apologize, but I have to preside over the General Assembly, which is already full and waiting for me, unfortunately.
Hey, we're holding up the General Assembly.
You know, I learned a great deal. I think that we need to continue working on this very ambitious, exciting global Green New Deal. And just a thought from the point of view of a geographer more, but we have to remind ourselves that a financial and trade architecture is the symptom of something that it goes deeper, and we really need to rethink our policy choices and our political decisions. We also need to rethink, you know, the current governance arrangements, and I wanted to share a few of the ideas on how we are trying to reinvent the UN and really have the UN being more relevant and more and closer to the people and the people closer to the UN. But unfortunately, I have to leave you. I want to thank Kevin, UNCTAD, everybody there, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. I hope you have a great weekend and you enjoy the cherry blossoms. And now I have to rush back to the General Assembly. So thank you very, very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. You take some questions?
I'll take one or two questions.
Take a few questions here. Please raise your hand and tell us your name. And if you want to comment on what these folks had asked before, if you need.
Hi, I'm Karen Strauss. I'll stand up because I'm all the way in the back. And I've worked for a long time, about 4 decades, on disability access. So I just wanted to bring in a different angle to all of this, and the importance of incorporating access for people with disabilities to ensure that developing countries are meeting the needs of these individuals. Recently, there's been efforts by Fiji, for example, to improve access to voting. Polling places, for example, going to the political pressure that you were talking about, access by Fiji to higher education, access by Mumbai to voting accessibility. And just generally, I wanted to comment on the importance of ensuring that countries' overall development policies include access for people with disabilities to assist in full participation in worker productivity, reducing dependence in isolation, and generally ensuring access to technologies. I know that it comes across in America very, very clearly. We have the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Unfortunately, because of a lack of multilateralism in that case, we have not signed the treaty, whereas almost all of the other developing countries have. So I just wanted to point this out and wondered if anybody had any comments on it.
Thank you. In the front here.
Luis Vieira with the Bretton Woods Project based in London. I have a question. You know, much has been said around how maybe the Agenda 2030 mirrors in some ways the Green New Deal, but ourselves and other partners are very concerned about the focus on private actors playing a developmental role. And the Prime Minister mentioned the tensions that exist between small states and the relationships with large corporations, transnational corporations. So I was wondering, from your point of view, what can you do as a smaller state to try to change the power dynamics that exist in those negotiations and interactions? Because it seems like this has been seen as a panacea, and smaller states are being driven to compete for mostly foreign direct investment, etc. So I wonder if you can conceptualize a different way of framing those issues, realizing the importance of private sector involvement in the smaller states. Thank you.
And last one back in the corner there.
Thank you. My name is Joe Thwaites from World Resources Institute. I was really pleased to hear a lot of references to the importance of climate financing. And I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, for Barbados, what are your key needs? What are you looking for from both the UN negotiations and from the MDBs, from some of the climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, in terms of meeting your climate financing needs?
Okay, thank you very much. With respect to the first comment on access for persons with disabilities, ironically, in addressing the diaspora in Canada 2 nights ago, I would have reflected on this and made it clear. Barbados is in a unique position where we're coming out or trying to come out of a difficult period, what I call the lost decade. 10 months ago, we inherited a government that had the 3rd largest debt to GDP in the world after Japan and Greece at 174%. We had foreign reserves of about 400 million Barbados dollars, 200 million US. We immediately, within 1 week, suspended our international debt payments and announced the restructuring of our debt. We've completed the domestic debt restructuring with 97% of the people eventually voting who could vote, and 96% voted, and 97% of those who voted voting for the program. We did pass legislation with collective action clauses, etc., to try and structure it in the absence of appropriate regulatory framework. We are in the middle of completing our external debt restructuring. Fortunately for us, that only constitutes 20% of our overall, 22% of our overall debt. But I say all of that to make the point that choices are very difficult for us to make now, but we choose still to do the things to constitute a good society. And we've done so because we've chosen to share the burden of the adjustment. We've shared the burden between capital and labor, rather than putting it all on labor, as has been done in every previous economic decline in the country's history since independence. We've shared the burden between domestic residents and tourists visiting, because tourists in fact constitute 3 times our population visiting on an annual basis and using our infrastructure in the same way that those who live there annually use it. We've chosen to share the burden with respect to those who have gotten the benefit of egregious contracts, rather than just purely coming after the user fees for those who use transport systems or other types of user fees within the system. And one of the things that we've determined is that in determining our capital works program, which is limited in terms of what government can do, because government doesn't only tax and spend, but where we tax and spend, there'll be a limited opportunity because of a determination to bring our debt to GDP down to 60% by 2033, that we have to become a good society. And there are certain things that we have to lead the way through, 1, our capital program, but 2, where we can't afford to continue to tax and spend, we use the other powers that government has as part of our fiscal governance: legislation, regulation, investment, empowerment, etc. So the combination of those things will help us continue to provide the wider access to those with disability. With respect to the question of the imbalance, now is perhaps not the time to ask me that. I've just come out of a budget speech where I had cause to remind a large investor in the Caribbean that we don't run a company, we run a country, and that we don't have the ability to be able to play fast and loose with the kind of egregious requests that I consider the rule of law paramount, because Barbados has one asset, is its reputation. The last government awarded tax incentives that were exceedingly egregious over a 25-year period fully, and then another 15 years thereafter. And they wanted more even on top of that. And I made the point that we will honor the agreements of the last government, because not to honor them will cause immeasurable consequences to our reputation. And to honor them will cause a large measurable hit. But I use that example to make the point that I watch around what is happening in the developing world, in the Caribbean itself. And there is a race to the bottom. And there's a deep, fast race to the bottom. And in fact, I've set up a joint public-private sector committee that is looking now at what we believe to be a fair, decent, reasonable deal. Do hotels need 25-year tax exemptions in order to recover their capital and in order to be able to function? I don't think so, but they all think so. And if we say no and everyone else says yes, what happens? So these are some of the issues that we have to confront. Now, having said that, the world is on a dangerous flirtation with how it treats to tax. In fact, the world is on a dangerous flirtation with how it treats to too many things. And at the core of the danger is the soundbite. At the core of the danger is a world that no longer entertains discussion, but that has a narrative that is determined by social media, and that's why I said this is a weapon as it is a tool. That's determined by social media, that's determined by a news cycle that is repeated ad nauseum, because it isn't really about educating or enlightening anybody. It is about being able to sustain advertising revenues. And why am I saying that? If I say fiscal, or as Professor Stiglitz just said, fiscal paradise, you immediately think of what? Cayman, BVI, Bermuda. Yeah, I want to say Delaware loud and hard. And Luxembourg. Anybody in here knows the corporation tax rate in Estonia? 0. Taxes, dividends. Barbados has had a low tax jurisdiction with respect to corporation tax rates. So people immediately assume, oh, you're a low tax, and the EU has just blacklisted us for being a potentially harmful jurisdiction as a low tax jurisdiction. Now, how does a country have low taxes when its revenue to GDP is 30%? Its revenue to GDP is 30%. We chose not to tax corporation taxes high. We choose to have a value-added tax at 17.5%. We choose to have excise tax. We choose to have import duties. We choose to have land taxes because land is a scarce commodity. We choose not to have death taxes. We choose not to have capital gains taxes. And we choose to have corporation taxes that are low because at the end of the day we recognize, or we are of the view, that in the same way the joint stock company evolved into the limited liability company, which evolved into all other kinds of variations in the 20th century here, and in the same way in our own jurisdiction in the last 40 years, we've seen the evolution of foreign sales corporations, international business companies, exempt insurance companies, all of which no longer exist, that we believe that corporation taxes are going to become a thing of the past in the next 15 to 20 years. And that, yes, regrettably, whether we like it or not, people are going to move more and more towards the taxation of assets and the taxation of transactions. And for those who don't believe it, name me one corporation in the world that does not pass on its costs and its taxes to the clients which it services. So we have to have some conversations that stop categorizing people and labeling people. Women know it well, and that's why you have the Me Too movement today. Small states, I tell people that I've never understood the full power of the movement until I had the confluence of being both a woman and a leader of a small state. And that is what you call being doubly blessed, but doubly hit and assaulted. The bottom line is that, and I use that as one example. I can use the one of Venezuela too. because the narrative that's taking place is not necessarily the narrative that is on the ground. And it reminds you of Wag the Dog. That's what it was, or Wag the Tail, Wag the Dog. The Dustin Hoffman movie, I think it was. Who hasn't watched it, go and watch it. So that we have a narrative being constructed that isn't necessarily real. I give you the other example. We talked about middle-income countries. Barbados was graduated in the World Bank in the early 1990s. We don't access concessional loans from the World Bank. We're in the middle of an IMF program now, an extended fund facility, because that's what we inherited, having had fiscal discipline between 1955 and 2007, never running the fiscal current account deficit more than 5 times, never 2 consecutive years, 5 times in 52 years across 6 governments. We then had one government that ran it every single year for 10 years and literally threw us on the ground. In the IMF program and the debt restructuring, clearly your options for accessing finance is going to be limited. We go to the World Bank and we say, okay, we need exceptional access as a middle-income country. Now, there is no middle-income country, no high-income country, no poor country that does not, no strong person, no weak person, that does not have a bad day or a bad year. But the rules are such that we are precluded from benefiting from concessional funding to fight the vagaries of climate change, to fight the vagaries of poverty alleviation at the very time when you need it more, at the very time when your vulnerability is greater than almost anyone else, not because of actions that you've taken, but actions that developed countries and large corporations have taken to increase the likelihood that climate change will have deleterious consequences on your people. And there is a hypocrisy that attends to this issue. China, for the purposes of the World Bank, is a low-income country. China can borrow. We don't even have access to borrow. And whether we get technical assistance is a matter of discretion. Now, I can go on with other countries like the Bahamas. Like others, Bahamas was hit how many times in hurricanes in the last few years? Instead of us using criteria that make sense, like vulnerability, inherent vulnerability, in the same way that we refused to make it with the WTO, we used rules that ignored the reality of small states. Our contribution to global trade in services is 0.0001%. Our contribution to global trade in goods is 0.0000%. We have no capacity to distort, but imposed upon us are the same one-size-fits-all rules in the same way that it is done for anti-money laundering, for all of these counterterrorism financing, when in truth and in the circumstances are that the countries that are really impacting and the real threats are not us, but in the developed world, in the capital cities that we know. So that we have a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation that bears no relationship to risk. So these are some of the issues that I throw out there at the same time to you that speak to the imbalance in power, whether it is to nation states, whether it is to large corporations, or whether it is sometimes to international organizations like the WTO. What was the last question?
What are your needs for climate finance?
Climate finance, and I kind of answered that just now
Sure.
by letting you know that as much as I need, I can't get. For the most part, we get from the IDB still, although the IDB is now caught in a vortex as to who should be the representative of Venezuela, and we hope that the institution is not divided. Having had its annual general meeting canceled 2 weeks ago in China because of the division between the United States of America and China, neither of whom, by the way, depend on the IDB for concessional funding. The Caribbean Development Bank and CAF are probably the only 2 entities. We hope that the Green Climate Fund will give us something. Look, when we became the government, I made a determination. I'm not interested in a lot of small loans. I'm not interested in any event, in a lot of debt because we have to bring our debt trajectory down, although I'm confident that we're going to increase our GDP such that we will be allowed to have some limited level of borrowing. And the major project for us and transformation project for me has to be the whole question of a roofs to reefs project. When I was a child, we walked, and at the back of the room is my Minister of Blue Economy and Maritime Affairs, the first in the Caribbean. And why? Because the marine space that we have is 400 times our land space. And if we don't start to manage it and protect it, we're not going to be able to even begin to be part of this debate and move our people forward. But we have determined that we want a roofs to reefs project. Roofs, because the last time Barbados was hit with a hurricane and we are on the outer end of the belt, was 60, 70 years ago, and we get hit every 60 to 70 years. We will either pay for a hurricane before or after, a natural disaster before or after. After the last hurricane, because of a shortage of carpenters, people started to build flat roof houses and stopped building the truss and the gables and the hip roofs that would protect the integrity of the house. So that our greatest fear is, even though we are a middle-income country, we will become literally having all the attributes of a low-income country after a hurricane hits us. And we feel that we need to try to start to get as many people to have access to concessional funding to be able to change out this roofing stock to protect the integrity of their house. Similarly, our coral reefs, when I was a child, we had all kinds of coral reefs. You go walk the beach, you get cobblers in your foot, sea eggs, all kinds of, you don't see anything like that at all now. And a large part of it is a combination of climate change, the warming of the oceans, the runoff from agriculture with sewage systems and agriculture as well combining. And we have determined that as a government we have to pay forward and to rebuild our coral reefs for future generations. 2/3 of our economy is probably coastal, and therefore we don't have a choice. But these are the things that we need serious concessional funding for, particularly the lumpy projects like sewage, like access for people to be able to borrow. But rather than have a lot of small projects, we want to focus on that. The other big one is to remove all of your overhead cabling, to put it underground. We've seen both in Puerto Rico and in Dominica that the failure to do that leaves countries without access to electricity for a substantial period of time. And then the last one would be the replacement of your piping system for water. The British would have put in most of our countries in the English-speaking Caribbean, pipes distribution system over 100 years ago. Regrettably, a lot of them are leaking in almost every single country, and therefore your non-revenue water in many of our countries is in excess of 50%. Now, if you don't have access to borrowing to do some of these large infrastructural things, that many of which are related to climate change, you are going to pauperize what was otherwise a middle-income nation. And that's why I speak with the passion that I speak today in Washington, or last year at the UN, because we really do feel that we've reached that moment in time where independence matters to none who are at the center of decision-making in the global community or the financial architecture of the global community. And that simple things that are not going to affect large countries but have a disproportionate impact on us, like the blacklisting of a country in the middle of an IMF program, not because we haven't fully committed to your criteria, but because we've said that you are likely to introduce new criteria which you have not put into writing. And therefore, while we can commit to what is known, we can't commit to what is not known. Now, these are the things for which we pay the prices. But the average financial investor does not have the time or the patience to understand the nuance or the rationale. And this is the reality in which we live, which is why I cited easily to you Nipsey Hussle and the reality of survival for individuals as for countries.
Folks, the C in UNCTAD stands for conference, and that was a conscious decision when they created the institution for it it being an ongoing conference and a conversation throughout time that it has done for decades now. That's also our mission as a university-based think tank like UNCTAD to bring an evidence-based view to the conversations. This conversation that we had today didn't start here, and it shouldn't end here. We hope that you take these great insights that we had from the President, the Prime Minister, and Professor Stiglitz, and you go home to your institutions and to your homes and to your countries, and to continue this conversation and make it a global one with the sense of urgency that we've heard today. So please let me thank all of you for coming, and thank you very much, Prime Minister, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.